Thousands of migrants are once again traveling from Central America to the US-Mexico border in the search of opportunity. These migrants are swimming through rivers and walking miles and miles along highways in hopes of either getting a job in Mexico or crossing the border to the US. Children, women, and men are all making this arduous journey in an attempt to escape from systematic poverty and violence. For many in the US, this so-called migrant caravan is a threat. Why are these people coming here? Are they bringing the violence they're escaping from with them? And why should we let them in? Well, the people who ask themselves these questions are probably unaware that it was the US that first crossed Latin American borders and exacerbated the seeds of poverty, inequality, and civil unrest planted by the Spanish colonial system that would later grow into the corruption and violence that fuel migrant caravans today. So, how did the US cause its own migration problem? You're watching Explore Mode, and today we're diving into the history of American intervention in Latin America and how it has fueled the migrant crisis today. America is known to Kool-Aid man its way into countries when its national security is at stake. In Latin America alone, the US intervened and changed governments in several countries at least 41 times, from 1898 to 1994. America's first steps towards making Latin America its business came in the form of the Monroe Doctrine. Time for an Express Explore explanation. Start the clock. In 1823, the fifth president of the US, James Monroe, decided that he wanted to make a statement that would define US foreign policies for years to come. See, at that time, many countries across the Americas were achieving independence, and Monroe decided it was the US's job to make sure that European countries didn't get any ideas about recolonizing the New World. So Monroe made a statement, which is now known as the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine had 4 main points. Number 1, the US would not get involved in internal conflicts within Europe. Number 2, the US would not meddle in existing colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Number 3, the Western Hemisphere would not tolerate being recolonized. And number 4, attempts from European countries to regain control of ex-colonies would be taken as a direct attack on the United States. Seems like pretty solid statements, right? But we have to look deeper. The Monroe Doctrine was the US marking its territory. Ironically, it condemned European intervention in Latin America while justifying its involvement in the region as it saw fit. The Monroe Doctrine then led to the Roosevelt Corollary, known as the Big Stick Policy. As America grew into an economic and military powerhouse, it saw fit to declare itself the protector of the Western Hemisphere. In the words of President Theodore Roosevelt, in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Variations of interpretations of the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary would then become commonplace in US foreign policy. In the years to come, it helped Washington excuse both forced or covert interventions in Latin America and then other countries outside the Western Hemisphere under the guise of moral obligation. Okay, so the US wanted to protect Latin America during a time of political instability. What's that got to do with what's going on now? To answer that, we need to go back in time, specifically to the history of the 4 countries migrants headed towards the US are escaping from: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. In 1951, Jacobo Árbenz was appointed as the 25th president of a deeply class-divided Guatemala. Jacobo Árbenz had been chosen by his predecessor, Juan José Arévalo, who was the first democratically elected president following the rule of Jorge Ubico, a US-backed dictator. Arévalo's presidency focused on developing social reforms, while at the same time surviving 25 coup attempts. The Guatemala that Árbenz had inherited was one where the descendants of the Spanish colonizers were wealthy and indigenous communities were impoverished. In an attempt to expand the middle class and move on from pseudo-feudalism, Árbenz proposed an agrarian reform, which would be approved by the Guatemalan Congress in 1952. But before we jump into the whole US intervention part, let's explain how Spanish colonialism left Latin America craving for progressive reforms. Time for an Express Explore explanation. Start the clock. When the Spanish came to Latin America, they started to take land under the Encomienda system. The system worked like this. The King of Spain gave certain colonizers in Latin American colonies the right and duty to take care of colonized land and a certain amount of indigenous people whom they had to feed, house, and of course, convert to Catholicism. In return, the indigenous people paid back in manual labor and tributes, essentially slavery. What this means is that for a long time, Latin American countries under the Encomienda system developed into deeply class-divided and unjust societies, where only a few held the power and indigenous and peasants lived in extreme poverty. Reformist political views in the 1900s Latin America came as a response to this toxic system. Through the agrarian reform proposed by Jacobo Árbenz, unused lands were redistributed to 500,000 families, many of which were ethnically indigenous. Sounds good, right? Well, the US didn't think so. At the time, an American company called the United Fruit Company owned 42% of Guatemala's arable land. So, when the Guatemalan government let them know that 234,000 acres of their uncultivated land would be expropriated and given to peasants, they weren't too happy. But before we continue, it's important to know what kind of work United Fruit Company was doing in the Latin Caribbean region at the time. Time to jump into a quick-fire round of Explore facts about the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company owned a lot of land in Latin America and the Caribbean from the late 1800s until the 1970s, where it had plantations of several tropical fruit, mainly bananas. You might be familiar with its more popular branding. Not only did it own large sections of the land, but it had also taken over transportation in Central America by opening its own railway and steamboat company. Apart from that, it managed to negotiate tax breaks in the countries it had taken over. Its farming practices greatly degraded acres of fertile crops, but that was of no concern to the company, as it would either take more fertile land, drain swamps, or burn down forests to create more arable land. Put simply, they were exploiting the land of impoverished countries for free. So, United Fruit was upset because its land was taken, particularly since the previous US-backed government had conveniently leased them fertile land for 99 years, tax exemptions included. Lucky for them, they had solid connections in, you guessed it, the US government. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was a board member at United Fruit, and his brother, Allen Dulles, was, get this, the director of the CIA. So they lobbied against Árbenz' administration, portraying him as a communist. In 1954, after intense pressure and threats from the CIA, Árbenz resigned and was replaced by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, the military man behind the CIA-backed coup. Árbenz' destitution and the CIA's intervention in the flourishing democracy left the Guatemalan people hopeless, indignant, and distrustful of their government institutions. It was no surprise then that in 1960 a civil war broke out in the country. The poor indigenous and peasants versus the government. The government backed by the United States, the people backed by Latin American communists. The war left the country in ruins. The battle between civilians and the military quickly turned into a genocide where mostly indigenous peoples, many of whom were not even involved in guerrilla groups, were killed senselessly, and many civilians were either kidnapped and tortured or killed. The war lasted 36 years until a peace accord was signed in 1996. America's intervention in Guatemala was one of many in Latin America during the 1900s. From 1912 to 1933, Nicaragua was under an American military occupation that was trying to call dibs on the construction of a Nicaraguan canal. The US didn't leave until a man called Augusto César Sandino led a revolution against the American military occupation. The US would make a second appearance in Nicaragua in the late 70s when it started training the Contras, a right-wing rebel group that opposed the socialist Sandinista movement. While all this was going on, Nicaragua was under the rule of the Somozas, an autocratic family oligarchy/dictatorship that ruled the country for more than 4 decades. In the 1980s, leftist groups in El Salvador were also fighting their own civil war. Same reasons over here: social injustice, economic inequality, and political corruption. The US contributed to the instability by backing the corrupt government with hundreds of millions of dollars in the form of military aid. El Salvador's civil war left more than 75,000 dead. Honduras, on the other hand, did not have a revolution or civil war, but was used by the US as a watchtower to keep its eye on its more rebellious neighbors. During the 1980s, the Reagan administration built several US military bases in the country to train the Nicaraguan Contra rebels. Before that, fertile Honduran soil had also been taken and destroyed by United Fruit Company, leaving Honduras dependent on its coffee trade, which the US also played a role in destabilizing. We're giving you an overview of these 4 countries because their people happen to be the ones making their way to the United States. So now that we know how the US meddled in their governments, let's take a look at how it affected their societies today. By the late 80s and early 90s, the civil wars caused by the game of socio-political and commercial chess the US played in the region were dying out. However, not everyone stayed to witness the mess that was left behind. This brings us to arguably the biggest contemporary problem: gangs. Towards the end of the civil wars, particularly in the 80s, many people from El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras fled to the United States, seeking refuge from the violence in their countries. However, once in the US, President Ronald Reagan, same one who was busy setting up military bases and training paramilitary groups in Central America, denied them asylum. Some of the young Salvadoran men who decided to stay illegally in the marginalized streets of Los Angeles realized that urban warfare was also taking place there between established gangs. So, they formed a gang themselves, La Mara Salvatrucha, better known as MS-13. The gang became more violent and militarized once former Salvadoran Special Forces member Ernesto Deras joined upon arriving in the United States in 1990. The young man's military knowledge he had acquired after being trained by the US's Green Berets during the Civil War, quickly put him at the top of one of the cliques of MS-13. It was under his rule that MS-13 evolved into the highly violent organized crime organization that we know today. Meanwhile, the number of undocumented migrants in the United States was growing. That's why in 1996, the US introduced the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act. Under this act, between 1998 and 2005, the US deported almost 46,000 undocumented migrants with felony charges. Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, known as the Northern Triangle, were hit the hardest. Suddenly, these countries that were recovering from decades of civil war and political tension had to manage a large influx of criminals. Truth is, they couldn't. These gangsters had managed to survive in the United States, and they would thrive in the Northern Triangle. Why? A 2007 United Nations report on crime and development in Central America synthesized it quite well. Central America was vulnerable to violence and crime post-Civil War due to the following reasons. Number 1, their people had suffered psychosocial trauma, meaning that people in this region had already witnessed brutal violence due to political conflict. Some were even forced to participate. This exposure normalized violence in the region. Number 2, many were educated in the skills of war. After the Civil War came to an end, former child soldiers from both the guerrilla and paramilitary groups were out on the streets. Without an education, these youths were at risk of joining gangs. Number 3, loss of state capacity and legitimacy. Civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador caused large damage to the infrastructure of government institutions, both physically and functionally. Corruption within the police is also not too great if you're trying to stop gangs from spreading. That last part is key when it comes to why violence and crime has not died out in Central America today. Let's jump into an Express Explorer explanation. Start the clock. Corruption. A virus that infiltrated the Northern Triangle while the civil wars were raging and has damaged the relationship between the government and civilians in these countries ever since. During the Civil War, governmental institutions, particularly the police and the military, often received bribes or external funding. This detached them from their roles as civil servants and warped the way civilians perceived them. Today, many citizens from the Northern Triangle view the police as another gang they have to bribe in order to live peacefully. According to a 2019 report by Transparency International on public perception of corruption, 28% of Honduran respondents said they have paid for bribes in the last 12 months. 23% of Guatemalan respondents reported to either have personally experienced or heard of officials asking for sexual favors as a form of extortion. 86% of Salvadoran respondents feared retaliation if they spoke out against corruption. The problem when the public perceives that they cannot trust legal institutions is that it creates an everyone-for-themselves mentality. The rich shield themselves by hiring security companies, and the poor either end up getting caught in the crossfire, taking justice into their own hands, or joining gangs, voluntarily or forcefully. It's no surprise then that in the 90s, 4 Guatemalan cities were in the top 10 Latin American cities by murder rate. According to data from the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes International Homicide Statistics, in 1996, El Salvador reported almost 120 deaths per 100,000 people. Honduras did not provide the UN enough information at the time for them to make an accurate estimate of their murder rate, which is in itself alarming. An article by The Intercept published in January of this year gives us an idea of why people are leaving the Northern Triangle today. Leonardo had received death threats from a criminal gang extorting money from the little store run out of his family's home on the eastern outskirts of San Salvador, and he stayed. But when the words progressed to bullets, he knew it was time to leave. They shot at the house. They fired 14 times, said Leonardo, who was inside with 2 other people at the time of the attack. Leonardo has since made it to the US-Mexico border, where he signed up on the local waitlist to cross into the United States and ask for asylum. His number is several hundred away from being called. You might be thinking, sure, Leonardo sounds like one of the good ones. But what about the bad ones? What if immigration raises crime rates? Are they not more prone to commit crimes? Short answer is no. According to an annual review report on immigration and crime, overall, our narrative review reveals that the most common outcome reported in prior studies is a null or non-significant association between immigration and crime. Indeed, 62% of effect size estimates reported in our sample are not statistically significant at the 0.05 level. Don't believe that? A report by University at Buffalo found no relation between immigration and increased crime. Lead author of the paper, Robert Adelman, said, "The results show that immigration does not increase assaults, and in fact, robberies, burglaries, larceny, and murder are lower in places where immigration levels are higher. The results are very clear." Another report from the Cato Institute that focused on immigration and crime in Texas stated, "Immigration enforcement programs targeting illegal immigrant criminals have no effect on local crime rates, which indicates that they are about as crime-prone as other residents." So what's the situation today? Well, according to a report by Brazilian think tank Igaripe Institute, at least 17 of the top 20 most homicidal countries in the world are located in Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. The region is still the world's most murderous in 2017, but some of the most violent countries saw improvement, including El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Although the situation is improving, it's far from what many would consider safe. Is it that surprising, then, that impoverished families are willing to walk for miles, cross rivers, and risk deportation just to get out? Before we go, we'd like to leave you with some literature on the topic in case you're interested in our sourcing or would like to read more about it yourselves. If you're interested in American involvement in Latin America, consider these books. Disappeared by June Ehrlich recounts the disappearance of Irma Flaquer, a Guatemalan journalist who was kidnapped, never to be found again during the Guatemalan Civil War. It gives an introduction, in an anecdotal form, of America's involvement in Guatemala. Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano explores how Latin America has been exploited by Europe and the United States in the past 500 years. The 2007 UN report on crime and development in Latin America, along with the reports done by the Igaripe Institute and Transparency International, all paint a pretty good overview of what's going on in the region as well. Links to all our other sources are in the description box below, timestamped for your convenience. For more news animations and explainers, hit the subscribe and bell button to join the TomoNews family. Thanks for watching.